It is time for another devotionable. All right, this week we're going to be talking about Joel. And in the book of Joel, it's kind of hidden right in the middle of the Old Testament. So if you go past Psalms, you're going to see Daniel. Daniel's a crowd favorite. A lot of kids love it. After that, Hosea. Then you've got Joel, Amos, and Obadiah. And so Joel is what's considered one of the minor prophets of the Old Testament. And we're going to look at Joel in 3 parts today. So let's start in chapter 1 of Joel. If you look, there may be a designation or like a header, a title at the top of your Bible, right there in the book of Joel, that may say something along the lines of devastation or locusts or something. Let's look at that in real good detail. You'll see it right in verse 3. Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. Well, what do we need to hear? What's the word? Go one more verse in verse 4, and things aren't looking good. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust is eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust is eaten. What the hopping locust left, the destroying locust is eaten. Well, what is this about locusts and everything? You may remember just a couple years ago, right in the midst of COVID, we had that like 17 or 18-year swarm of cicadas here. Well, cicadas are kind of like the North American version of locusts in the ancient Near East. And so they're yucky. They're gross. You keep your mouth closed when you're outside because you don't want one to fly in there or in your hair or whatever. It's disgusting. And we notice that there are levels of these locusts. Why is Joel going into detail about these? Because he's trying to make the emphasis on the devastation of Israel. Locusts aren't the problem. It's the invading nations that have come and have taken over Israel. And the devastation that they've left by removing the people even. And those that are there are starving and things are not good. Things are not going to plan at this point. Israel is ravaged. And this was not the promise. God's promise, and a guy named Graham's Goldworthy, whose books I have here, have made it kind of known, or just a simple equation to use for Old Testament study, is that God's people should be in God's place under God's rule. And that was the plan for the Old Testament. That was the plan in the garden. Adam and Eve, God's people, in God's place, the garden, under God's rule. They walked with him daily. And we see that that was turned upside down, and that was not the way that it was supposed to be. And then they get to the promised land after all those years wandering with Moses, and now it's again God's people in God's place under God's rule, but the people demand a king. And we see things get topsy-turvy and go under, and a few hundred years later, we have the invasion of Assyria to the north, and Babylon to the southern kingdom, and the people are exiled, and again, we have God's people not in God's place and not under God's rule. And that's what Joel is emphasizing here by these locusts that have picked clean the land. They have just come in and taken all of the vegetation. There are no crops left. There is no hope left for Israel. So then we transition into chapter 2. Chapter 2 of Joel might be one of the top 5. I mean, if Pastor Gabe and Pastor Adam were making like a top 10 video for chapters of the Old Testament, this has got to make the list. I'll be mad. I'll crash their video or something if it's not part of the top 10 chapters of the Old Testament. Let's find out why. The first thing that you'll see is that there's a blow of trumpet in Zion in verse 1. And so, Zion's being summoned. All right, well, who lives in Zion? God. All right, so he's being summoned. There is an army coming from Zion. It's God's army. And as we look through this in chapter 2, verse 12, we see this verse. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. He is extending an olive branch. There is a way to return to the Lord. The way that we return to the Lord is with all our heart, fasting, weeping, mourning. Why? Because we have been devastated. You might find yourself right now, you are in a place where you feel like your world is devastated. Your hopes, your plans, your dreams have all been ravaged. The world has not fulfilled any promises that you thought it would for your life. Your flesh, the devil, they have not made good on promises you thought they would. And your life, your hope, you are in misery. It's all been ravaged. You may feel very much like Israel right now. Well, there is hope. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. And then we see down in chapter 2, verse 19, I am sending you grain, new wine, and olive oil, enough to satisfy you fully. Whoa, if you're a Christian, you hear that verse and you go, hold on, wait, I remember, what was the first miracle that Jesus did? It was at the wedding of Cana, and it was new wine, not old wine in old wineskins. It was new wine in new wineskins. Jesus is bringing new wine. And we hear this and we start making New Testament connections. You as a Christian, when you're doing your devotions, you need to be making New Testament connections and realize, hold on, God had a larger plan. There is a larger narrative at place here just than what's going on in the book of Joel. And then you see in verse 25, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. God is making good on his promise to Israel that yes, you have been ravaged, but I will make you whole. I will make you complete if you return to me. And then we see in verse 28, it just keeps coming. One great verse after the next in this chapter. We just keep it rolling. I will pour out my spirit. Boom, like bells ringing, alarms going off. Like there should be something connecting us to the Old Testament. But wait, press pause for just a second, because this is not just a Joel thing. If you look at Ezekiel 39, God promises that he will pour out his spirit. If you look at Isaiah 32, God promises that he will pour out his spirit. There is an impending pouring out of God's spirit. The spirit is not a New Testament phenomenon. He was there at the creation. He was there the whole time. We have to have a Trinitarian theology that understands that Father, Son, and Spirit have coexisted from the beginning. And so then we see the culmination of this in Acts chapter 2 and the pouring out of the Spirit. But Peter specifically recalls back to Joel 2:28. He quotes this verse. It shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Great hope. If you're somebody in ancient Israel and you're reading that brings hope. You might be in a foreign land. You might be just miserable in Israel. All right? But if you read that, there's hope. And for us as Christians, there should be hope. The Spirit's been poured out. We have access to him now. And so when you read about the Spirit in the Old Testament, be grateful that you have access to the Spirit now, and that he's already been poured out, and that he can change and affect your life right now. So then we move on to the third act. This is where God will judge the nations in chapter 3, the third chapter of Joel. It's a small book, so I keep on having trouble turning that last page. And you'll see that for about 14 verses, it talks about that God is going to come in and he's going to consecrate war, and he's going to put in the sickle. The harvest is ripe. Multitudes and multitudes in the valley of decision. All these things that seem like very violent, perhaps, and you're like, this is what some theologians would use the term imprecatory, which means that like God is being super vengeful in these moments and is like fighting for you. And some people in our modern society look at verses like this and they're like, ooh, this doesn't line up with the God of the New Testament. And he's like, this is very different. If you're a person in Israel who has been led out of Israel by hooks and fish hooks by their nose, attached to the nose in front of the person in front of them, you are wanting vengeance. You want things to be made right. God is promising in verses like this and with descriptive language like this that he will make things right. And it's not that the nations have no chance. Notice this. God throughout this is saying, Tyre, Sidon, Philistia, how did you treat my people Israel? And ultimately it's, how did you treat my son, Jesus? We need to be cognizant of that because we are the nations. We were given hope. Those of us that are not Jewish by heritage, we were given hope. We were given a chance. How did we treat Jesus? Did we cast him out? Or did we embrace him and believe in him and follow him and have had a life change because of our interaction with him? The verses near the end of chapter 3 are a reminder of the strength of the Lord. Look at verse 3:16. The Lord will roar. All will tremble. The Lord will be a refuge. He is powerful. He's not someone to be trifled with. He is great. And although it seems like he has been gone, he has not. This has been a punishment from the Lord. The nations persecuting Israel was a punishment. It is a reminder. It is a warning for us that we should draw near to the Lord because he is a refuge. Verse 3:17, then you will know, dwell in Zion. Whoa, hold on. Wait. Here's the completion of this promise. God's people in God's place, in God's rule. Remember that Graham Goldsworthy guy? This is God's promising how things will be, should be, and are going to be. And so we finish with a flourish here in chapter 3, verse 21. I will not leave their blood unavenged, for the Lord dwells in Zion. And so there's hope for the people of Israel, but greater than that, there's hope for the nations, because this is a promise of the resurrection. Jesus' blood would not be left unavenged. In fact, Jesus' blood was taken to the true mercy seat, put on it for us so that we will have hope, not just of a resurrection of Jesus, but a resurrection for ourselves, that we might be with God. So when we're reading Old Testament books, we need to be looking for those connections to the New Testament. We need to be understanding the current context and how much hope this brings for people who are in exile or in devastation. And we need to understand that God's had a plan all along, and that He didn't shift gears, He didn't change things. It's always been pointing to the cross. Thank you so much. Hopefully this is helpful to you. And I've got my volunteer badge here for the preschool. If you need a ministry to serve in, there's a lot of devastation over there every Sunday. You can come in and be a servant of the Lord and help those kids learn more about Jesus.